I've been writing about maker projects for nearly a decade on websites like Hackster, Hackaday, and the official Arduino blog. In that time, I've written several thousand articles, so I've developed a pretty good idea of what kind of content does well. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips on how you can get featured on sites like those. This isn't just a pride thing, though there's nothing wrong with being proud of the recognition. It can also benefit you. If you're running a YouTube channel, it can bring in more subscribers. If you plan to sell your creation, it can get the attention of interested buyers. And if you're trying to raise awareness for a cause, this can help. Writers like myself are always looking for new projects to cover, so these tips should help you stand out from the crowd. So tip number one, be very clear about what your project is and what it does. This might seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how many projects I come across that fail to do this. Your project video or write-up should make it obvious within just a few seconds what you've accomplished. Don't bury the lead. As an example, let's say you built a new kind of flash cart for the Atari Lynx. Don't spend the first 5 minutes of your video going over the history of the link before you explain what your project does. Instead, lead with that information and then talk about the history. Even better, make it clear in your title if you can. When searching for projects to cover, I have to dig through a lot of videos and blog posts. If I can't figure out the purpose of your project in a reasonable amount of time, then I'll just move on to the next one. I do have more patience than the average TikToker, so I'm not saying you need to speak like you're running an auction, but you should try to say what your project is and why it's special as soon as possible. Returning to the Atari Lynx example, a great opening statement would be something like, I designed an Atari flash cart with more storage space than anything else out there. That will get my attention. Moving on to tip number two, tell us what hardware and components you used. I mostly see this problem coming from makers that cater to a general audience rather than other makers. Mark Rober is a good example. He does fantastic work, but his channel is so big that he has to make content that's engaging to a general audience rather than just people that are interested in engineering and hardware. He can do that because he's wildly popular and doesn't need my coverage. But sites like Hackaday and Hackster are for makers and engineers. Readers want information about the components you used, but I can't give them that information if you don't share it. I often find myself scrubbing through YouTube videos frame by frame just to try to catch a glimpse of a component I can identify. I'm not saying that you need to list every single resistor and its value, though bill of materials wouldn't hurt, but you should at least divulge the major components like microcontrollers, drivers, and sensors. And specificity is good, so instead of saying, I used an Arduino, say, I used an Arduino Uno R3. Many people say Arduino when they're actually talking about a specific microcontroller or another development board entirely, so this will help to clear things up. See my recent video on Arduino misconceptions if you're interested in that topic. And tip number three, include good visuals. My articles about maker projects do a lot better when I can include some good pictures. It's really important that you include at least one beauty shot of your device that I can use for the featured image, and more than one would be great. I also like to include helpful diagrams and illustrations, as well as shots of the internal components. If you're doing a project write-up on a blog or something, then just throw in a ton of pictures. You don't have to be a professional photographer, but at least try to show your build clearly. If you do have photography skills, then one or two glamour shots will do a lot to capture the interest of readers. For those of you who only post videos, try to consider how somebody covering your project might approach that. In my case, I go through and try to capture screenshots. I can't tell you how much time I've spent trying to click at exactly the right moment to get a good screenshot. If you can do it without sacrificing the quality of your video, then try to include a couple of lingering shots of your project. You can also put photos in a blog post and then link to those in a description of the video. And one last note on this topic. Close-up shots are great, but so are photos with some room around the subject. Thanks to the way websites display photos, they often get cropped to several different aspect ratios. A thumbnail might be square, while a featured image might be 16 by 9. By leaving room around your subject, you allow for that cropping without cutting into the subject itself. My worst case scenario is when the only thing available is a portrait video. That gets really hard to work with. And tip number four, make your project either interesting, useful, or both. The best way to increase your chances of getting featured is to make a project that's either interesting or useful. Useful is pretty straightforward in this context. Does it solve a real-world problem that people have? Does it do it better than other solutions that are currently out there? Here's a recent real example. I wrote an article for Hackster about someone who developed a rechargeable lithium-ion battery pack for vintage Texas Instruments calculators. For enthusiasts of those calculators, that's a very useful project. It might be niche, but those enthusiasts are going to care enough to click on that article. Interesting is a lot harder to quantify, but it's what I cover the most often. A recent real example of this is Guy DuPont's delightful ThinkPad Nubbin light switch dimmer project. isn't very practical or useful. I doubt anybody's replicating that project, but it's a unique spin on familiar hardware and therefore interesting. Another example is the cyberdeck. I've written dozens of articles about cyberdeck projects, but the frequency is dying down. Why? Because they've become common enough that they're no longer interesting unless they do something new and innovative to stand out. Cyberdecks are rarely built for any practical reasons, so they need to find some other way to stand out. But even today, I'll cover a cyberdeck build if the design is really cool, or if it uses unusual hardware, or has innovative features. On to tip number 5. Make your project open source. This isn't a requirement, and I do sometimes cover closed source devices, including proprietary, patented consumer products, but I much prefer projects that give something back to the maker community. On top of that, readers are much more likely to click if you're providing code, 3D files, or schematics that they can use. There is certainly value in providing a broad explanation of how you did something, but there's so much more value in giving that design to your audience. I'm not shaming you if you want to sell your design instead. You put that work into development, and it's entirely your right to try to make money on that. Our job as writers is to put out articles that engage our readers, and they respond well to open source content. So consider diving into the open source philosophy, because it can benefit you too. Now I have one final bonus tip for those of you who have stuck around this long. Tell us your name. Whether it's your actual name, a pseudonym, or just the username you prefer, try to put that information somewhere so we know how to refer to you. For example, this channel is called Serial Hobbyism, but it would be clumsy to try to refer to me by the channel's name. So I try to make sure people can find out my actual name, which is Cameron Coward. You should do the same. And if you really want to help out the writers who may be covering your projects, try to include your pronouns somewhere too. When I don't know a person's pronouns, I use either they or go by how they present. But I've made mistakes in the past. Including your name and pronouns can help us to avoid embarrassing ourselves, especially if they aren't obvious by the way you present or if you do faceless content. All right, folks, those were my tips. If you follow them, there's a very good chance your project will be featured on a website like Hackster, though I'm definitely not guaranteeing anything. Ask away in the comments if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.